Good evening. Hope everybody's doing well tonight. We are. Oh, you're back. Wasn't expecting to see you tonight. You've been out of town, right? Okay. Well, that changes everything. No, I'm just kidding. I did that myself. Let's see here. Okay. There are 7 keys. We've been studying, of course, the book of Revelation, been introducing the book. My daughter asked me a few days ago, said, "How long can you spend on the introduction, Dad?" I said, "Well, there's a lot to introduce in the book of Revelation." So we went over the 7 keys, and I want to mention something. Remind me to come back to number 4. But I want to mention something just in case I forget. I hopefully will not, but I was looking for, I think I was looking up my last Wednesday night class in here just to make sure I had correct where we left off. Usually when I have paper notes up here, I just write down where I leave off, but if I'm using slides, I have those here, and so I just have to depend on my memory, which is not always a good thing. But I was looking for that, and it was interesting because just pops up on my YouTube, suggested for you. It says from 2017, so a little over 2 years ago, and it says Cliff Goodwin Power Lectures, South Haven, Mississippi, Keys to Understanding the Book of Revelation. So I thought, hey, I'm going to check this out. And it's interesting because I don't know if he'd been studying some of the same material that I've used a lot and leaned on a lot for our study here, the Unlocking Revelation book by Brother Stafford North. But here, I'm going to give you these, and we're not going to go in depth with them because they're very similar to the 7 keys that we've looked at. And you can compare these as I go through them. But his all start with the letter A. So you got to like that. They're alliterated. But he actually has 6, not 7. He combines some of these. Number 1 is appreciate. He says, appreciate the symbolic nature of the book. Well, that's key number 1 as we talked about it. I like this statement that he made in there. He said, symbols don't mean what they say. Symbols mean what they mean. And you think about that for a second. You say, well, we often say, hey, I mean what I say. And sometimes we'll look at a passage and, sort of the joke in preaching school was that the way some folks approach a Bible class is they go and they have somebody read a verse and they say, okay, brother, what do you think that means? And he says, well, I think it means what it says. And he says, well, I do too. Let's go on to the next verse. But that's the way it is when you're reading maybe books of law, books of history. But when you get to a book that is what we categorize or call apocalyptic literature, it's written in signs, it's written in symbols. Symbols don't mean what they say. They mean what they mean. And the symbols mean something. So bear that in mind. Appreciate the symbolic nature. Number 2. Admit that it is somewhat difficult and a potentially dangerous book of the Bible. So number 2 is admit. Admit that this book, and he made the point, and I like this point. It's not to say it can't be understood, but can we at least admit, and I think most of us here from conversations I've had since we began this class, I think we understand that. I think most of us understand that we admit sometimes people act like, now, and I've said before, in one sense, Revelation is the easiest book in the Bible. Victory for God's faithful. But in another sense, it's a difficult book. You're probably familiar with 2 Peter 3. It's verses 15 through 17, where Peter talks about, in fact, if you want to just flip back just a little bit to look at that. It's just a few pages in my Bible. 2 Peter 3. He's been talking about end times. He's talking about the end of time and account to the long suffering of our Lord is salvation. Verse 15 says, even as our beloved brother Paul also according to the wisdom given unto him hath written unto you, as also in all his epistles, speaking in them of these things, talking about end times, in which are some things, what does he say? Hard to be understood. Now he doesn't say, man, Paul's writing things that you can't understand. Don't worry, don't try, don't bother. You can't understand it. He doesn't say that. He says there's some things that are hard to be understood, which they that are unlearned and unstable wrest, as they do also other scriptures, unto their own destruction. That's interesting. Can we go to the book of Revelation and at least admit that, hey, this is not always going to be the easiest as far as getting all the details and things? It's a somewhat difficult book, and it is a potentially dangerous book. A lot of people have gone to the book of Revelation, wresting it, as Peter uses that term by inspiration, wresting the scriptures of Revelation to teach all kinds of false and damnable doctrines. So that's number 2 that he gives, admit. Number 3 he gave was accept. Accept interpretations that are given in the book. Well, we noticed one of these last week, Revelation 12, 9, and Revelation 20, verse 2. When the book tells you that the dragon is Satan, guess who the dragon is? It's Satan. If the book gives you an interpretation, hey, go with it. And that seems obvious. And, he even made the point in his lesson that sometimes people will say, well, everybody knows the dragon is Satan. Well, how do you know that? Because the text tells you. You accept what the text says. And that comes into play in other places, and we'll get to it when we study the chapter. But Revelation 17, really there's a whole section, and I won't read all of it, but really 7 on down through about verse 10, maybe even more, where he's talking about the woman, the harlot, and the beast. He mentions the 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth. Now you're ready to study a little bit more in depth and figure out what exactly are those mountains. There are 7 kings, verse 10. I was looking for another verse, 12. Is it 12? Yeah, the 10 horns thou sawest are 10 kings. Well, guess what the 10 horns are? They're 10 kings. What 10 kings are those? Well, again, that's where you start getting a little more into the verse by verse and a little more in depth, and we'll talk more about that when we get there. But except when the book gives you an interpretation of a symbol. And again, there's a perfect example. Symbols don't mean what they say, they mean what they mean. The dragon is not a literal dragon. The dragon is Satan. Number 4, appropriate. We've talked about this. I don't know if this is one of our 7 keys, but we talked about it in the intro. Appropriate relevant Old Testament references and imagery. We mentioned this with the book of Daniel. One scholar has said that Daniel is the prototype of apocalyptic literature. I'm with Cliff. I don't know if I would necessarily go so far as to say that, but there are other apocalyptic books as well, or at least within books. But it certainly there's a lot of imagery from the book of Daniel. Revelation 12, verse 9, when he mentions that old dragon, the serpent, where does your mind automatically go? The Garden of Eden. Because the serpent was more subtle than any other beast of the field, right? That's Old Testament imagery. And again, that's one that people say, well, come on, man, everybody knows that. How do you know that? You're drawing on that imagery from Genesis 3. There's another example, Revelation 7. If you look at verse 9, you have this great multitude, no man could number, all nations, kindreds and people and tongues, stood before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with what? White robes. And in fact, you can go down just the same chapter, just a few verses further. 14, I said unto him, Sir, thou knowest. He said to me, These are they which came out of great tribulation, and have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Now, I don't know if your mind automatically goes there. We think of white so often to symbolize purity. But my mind, when I read that, goes almost immediately to Isaiah 1:18. Come now, let us reason together, saith the Lord. Though your sins be as crimson, they shall be as wool. Though they be red like crimson, they shall be as white as snow. So white, representing purity. Here you see that imagery again in the book of Revelation. There are several examples of that. And a lot of these in the book of Revelation they're examples that they're just so familiar we almost don't even think about it. I don't know that I had really given these much thought until listening to Cliff's lesson. And I thought, oh yeah, because like he said, everybody knows the serpent. You think about the devil. because of Genesis 3. But you know that because of Genesis 3. So same thing when you get to Revelation. So appropriate, relevant Old Testament references and imagery. And then number 5, number 5 is to acknowledge. Acknowledge the time element. This will be number 2, the 7 keys that we've been using. Acknowledge the time element. He adds with that also to respect the audience and the occasion. The audience, of course, the immediate audience, being those 7 churches of Asia. The occasion being persecution. Now, we've talked about all that. And then number 6 is avoid. And this point is, this is not one of our 7 keys, but we've made this point in the introduction. Avoid missing the forest for the trees. People sometimes come to Revelation and they get so hung up on so many details and they miss the forest because they're so focused on these little individual trees within the book. Don't miss the big picture. Jesus wins. And if you're on the side of the Lamb, you win. You are victorious. If you lose that, you've messed up. You've gone astray from the beginning. So I thought that was very interesting. I happened to run across that and wanted to share that with you. I mentioned number 4. I was talking to some folks last week, and we were talking about, identifying the dragon, the beast. And the question was asked, how can we know who the beast is? And, again, sometimes this is part of symbolic language, apocalyptic literature. And by the way, if we run across something and you say, maybe I didn't explain it well, maybe there's still some questions there, please let me know. I always say I can't answer a question if I don't know that question is there. I can't deal with something or cover it thoroughly if I don't realize that I didn't cover it thoroughly before. There are certain times, not just in the book of Revelation, but in any symbolic language, there are times when it may not come out and say, this is what that is. And especially when you're dealing with apocalyptic literature and this symbolic language. But with the beast, and really with the harlot, with the second beast, even the 1260 days, you have to put together, what do we know about these things? And when you start putting all that together, you ask yourself, you put all that together, but you also, as we have said so often, put on your first century glasses, right? And you say, okay, what could that be? And with the beast, this first beast, you've got, here's a major persecutor of Christians. This beast represents a world power, and this is again drawing on that Old Testament reference, that Old Testament imagery from the book of Daniel. You see the image in Daniel chapter 2, you see the beasts in Daniel chapter 7, and you draw on all that, and this is a world power. This is a world power that persecutes Christians, makes war with the saints, reigns over every tribe, tongue, nation, is worshipped. This is an empire that opposes God. It's persecuting God's people. It's deifying its leaders. And you put yourself in the first century. You're a member of the Lord's church at Ephesus, Smyrna, Thyatira, Laodicea, whichever one of those 7 congregations. Is there anything else that's going to come to your mind other than this beast is Rome? This is Rome. I guarantee you it's not going to be it's not going to be a reinvented Rome, as we'll see in a moment that the future approach teaches. It's not going to be some other nation thousands of years in the future or even hundreds of years in the future. When they read that, I can say with certainty, the first thing that comes to their mind is that beast is Rome. Of course, the heads represent kings. We noticed that already from chapter 17. The 7 heads are 7 hills or 7 mountains, and Rome's often referred to as the city founded on 7 hills. There's nothing else that would have come to their mind that I can think of other than Rome. And if you think of something, let me know, because honestly, I can't think of anything. So that's why we say on that one, the text says beast, but it means Rome. You remember, symbols, they don't mean what they say, they mean what they mean. And we talked about the picture of the fellow with the one arm. Here's what it says, one arm, here's what it means. Says beast means Rome. And then that second beast we identified as emperor worship. And again, we'll talk more about those as we come, but I want to mention that one because I was talking to some folks last week, and we were talking about that, and that kind of was the question was, well, how can we be certain? And I think, some of these, I think cases can be made in another direction. That's something that's not going to be a false doctrine. It's not going to change the person as far as, affect salvation or how we worship, how we live as, the Christian life. But this one, I don't see how it could be anything else. You study that in context. Now, let's go and start testing the keys and see how they work. Now that we've got the 7 keys, let's see how they work on these different approaches to the book of Revelation. I mentioned last week, the first one that we're talking about is the future time approach. This approach says nearly all of the book is yet to be fulfilled. This would be your stereotypical premillennial dispensational approach. Basically, very little of the book was fulfilled in that time. It's looking, 90%, I don't know what the percentage is, but probably 90% or more, they would say, is yet to be fulfilled. So that's the future approach. But let's put this to the test with those keys that we now have for the book. Key number 1, the book is written in symbols. Listen, the future approach makes just about everything in the book literal. It makes just about everything literal. Let me pause right here because I forgot something I wanted to mention to you. Cliff mentioned this in his lesson, and it just struck me because I had not even thought about it. Have you ever thought about what we talked in our intro material about how unique the book of Revelation is? Have you ever thought about this? This book it's written in symbols. It's very apocalyptic in nature. It deals a lot with end times, but it's also prophecy, right? There's a lot of prophecy. In fact, it's referred to several times within the book as prophecy. Now, what do people typically think when you say the word prophecy? They think something from the future. And yet, when you study the Bible, what is prophecy typically? Far more often. It's what we would call, when we say prophecy, most people think of foretelling. But really, what most of prophecy is biblically is forth, F-O-R-T-H, forthtelling. In other words, it's proclaiming God's will, not necessarily something that's off in the future. How many times the prophets dealt with that? But they dealt far more with God's people right now and the need to turn to God now and to follow God now. So there's a lot of prophecy in the book of Revelation as well, but I don't think I'd ever given this much thought until listening to that lesson. He mentions that Revelation is also would fit into the category, at least parts of it, what we call the epistles or letters, because you have 7 letters contained right here within the book. So that's very interesting. That one of the things that makes Revelation so unique, prophecy. It's an epistle written from an apostle, of course, inspired by the Holy Spirit. It's also this apocalyptic revelation pertaining to things that are shortly coming to pass. Now, sorry about that. I happened to think of that and I forgot it. Going back to testing the keys here on this future time approach, the book is written in symbols. The future view makes almost everything literal. You got things like they say, locust. Well, if you're in John's time, and the nearest thing you could come to describing a modern day Apache helicopter or a Black Hawk or whatever it is a locust. And so John says he saw all these locusts. He didn't know what to think of that. He's seeing helicopters. Are you kidding? All he could come up with was locust. At least Daniel could come up with, hey, I can't really describe this beast, so we're just going to call it the diverse beast. He could have at least called it a diverse locust or something, right? And I'm being facetious, but come on. They say things like that, horses with fire coming from their mouths. Those are tanks, modern day tanks. Try to make everything literal. It's forgetting key number 1. It's just throwing key number 1 out. Revelation clearly was meant to be more figurative than literal language. Key number 2 is what? Y'all need to remind me, I need to print out some little sheets with the 7 keys on them so we can keep these with us as we go along. The time frame, shortly come to pass, right? But the future view says way, way, way more of the book than not. The vast majority of the book doesn't happen for 2,000 plus years, 2,000 years and counting, actually. Not even a trumped up, revived version of the Roman Empire, supposedly emerging from the European Union or tomorrow's whatever union it might be, not even that can match the picture of the beasts in Revelation. And it certainly doesn't match in the time frame of shortly come to pass. You're throwing that out. Yes, sir.
No matter what keys we get to, there's no getting around, just like going back to key number 1. Chapter 1, verse 11. John is instructed by the Lord himself to take and write down what you see and hear and send it to whoever it's being sent to. It has to have meaning to them.
Yep.
Saddam Hussein has no meaning to the 7 churches of Asia, which will not even be around.
Right, and that's number 3. That's no, you're good. That's number 3. It's written to give comfort to persecuted Christians. And what, like you said, what is that? How is that comforting to a first century Christian that they've lost their homes? Maybe people are not doing business with them in the Roman Empire because they don't have this seal, this mark. They don't have this proclamation that you've declared Caesar is Lord. Oh, but 2,000 years from now, it doesn't work. The key doesn't fit. The future view offers no comfort to those 7 congregations. Revelation, the book, is clearly focusing on an imminent threat to those Christians. That's obviously what the book is dealing with. Telling them about a war, some kind of battle, a literal battle of Armageddon, that's 2,000 plus years away. How is that of any comfort to suffering saints? It's just not. Key number 4, of course, is the dragon and the beast are identified. We talked about that. The future view would make the first beast the Roman Antichrist. That's what they would say. He comes up just before the end of the world. He's going to try to destroy Christians and all this, persecute Christians, persecute God's people. Then the futurist view makes the second beast the Jewish Antichrist, who comes up at the same time as the first beast. But there's a problem with that. What's the problem? Does anybody see where we're going with this? I have an idea, I know, that the readers of John's day, especially some of these recipients, they would have been familiar with a couple of verses from the pen of John himself in 1 John, chapter 2. Somebody, if you would, read for us 1 John 2, 18, and then go ahead and just read verse 22. Mm-hmm.
Who is a liar, that he that denieth that Jesus is the Christ, he is the Antichrist that denieth the Father and the Son.
He is an Antichrist. You notice the Bible never talks about the Antichrist. It uses it as an Antichrist. And based on verse 22, who's an Antichrist, Brother Robert? Anybody that denies the Son, denies Jesus has come in the flesh. You're working, what does anti mean? It means against. If you're working against Christ, guess what? You're an Antichrist. That fits a lot of people, honestly, even to this day. And of course, in verse 18, he says there are many Antichrists. And sometimes people talk about what's going to happen in the last days. And they say like it's some, and a lot of times they tie it in with the book of Revelation and getting near to the battle of Armageddon, the last days, and this is going to happen, that's going to happen. And yet John says we're living in the last days, even as recent as the first century. So what does that mean, by the way, when he says the last days? That poor old John, was he just mistaken? Bless his heart, he thought it was going to be the end of time soon, and he just had it all wrong. This is the last dispensation of time. The first dispensation is what we refer to as what? Patriarchal. God would speak directly to the heads of the households. Abraham, you had Noah, Job was in that time period. And then what was the second dispensation? We call it the Mosaic. The law of Moses kind of ushered in that dispensation. That was to guide us up to the Christ. And then when Jesus died on the cross, the first day of Pentecost after his resurrection, the inauguration of the new covenant. And the new covenant began. Peter used the keys of the kingdom to open the doors, and men began to become members of the kingdom of Christ, the church. And that is the last dispensation. Peter tells us, we know 2 Peter 3 a while ago, we looked at the tail end of that, but the last time, in other words, at the end of the Christian dispensation, there's not going to be another dispensation. The world's going to be destroyed, there will be the judgment, and eternity will ensue. John's readers would have been familiar with these verses. There's just no way you could say this first beast was some kind of Roman Antichrist way off in the future. You know, way you could say the second beast is some kind of Jewish Antichrist. The future view just simply fails to view the book, as we say, through first century glasses. It just doesn't fit. The keys won't unlock that approach to the book. The kingdom is identified also. Yes, sir.
What good would it do to people back there in the first century, like you're pointing out here, all that had to do with the tanks and so forth? They wouldn't understand what comfort and what warning would that have been to those in the first century, like one of them.
Okay.
I believe the reason why Revelation is put it back to the book is so when we read the book and study it, we'll be in a better position to understand the book of Revelation. You don't have a working knowledge of the Bible, you're completely lost when you get to Revelation and study it. But when the Bible tells us something about Daniel and so forth, you've got to understand of that. You'll do pretty good with Revelations and studying it. But this business about the future, I can't see where that would hit Christians back anything else back to the 70s.
No, it doesn't. I mean, can you imagine that if you're suffering and somebody says, look, I'm sorry to hear about all you're going through, but let me tell you what's going to happen in a few thousand years. I mean, it's going to be these helicopters, these flying things, they're just like locusts to you. But yeah, I'm real sorry about your brother and all of them has been killed for being Christians. But let me tell you about this. Well, there's just no comfort in that. And that's exactly what we're talking about here. And that's an interesting point about the book being at the end of the Bible, because you're drawing on a lot of imagery from the rest of the Bibles. That's a good point there. Makes sense, because if you know some stuff about, you read the rest of the Bible, when you come to that and you got some knowledge, then you're in a better position to approach the book the correct way. Yes, sir.
Yeah, one of the most sobering texts in the book of Revelation to me personally. You go to Revelation chapter 6, 2 verses, 10 and 11. And it says, and they cried with a loud voice, saying, how long, O Lord, holy and true, that dost thou not judge and avenge our blood on them that dwell on the earth? And white robes were given to every one of them, and it was said unto them that they should rest yet for a little season unto their fellow servants also and their brethren that should be killed as they should be fulfilled. This is a bleak time. These people are crying to God, saying, how long are you going to wait, God? Avenge our blood. And we're going to ride about 2,000 years in the future.
Yeah, it just doesn't
And
fit.
it says, just hang on. Some of you have yet to have been put to death. In other words, this suffering is not over. That is sober. That these people are crying for relief. And God says, it's not coming.
Yeah, the relief is coming, not yet. There's going to be some things, and in fact, that question is not even answered even in the book until several chapters later. You have to kind of almost put your mind on pause there, and all this panorama that John is seeing unfolds, and it's kind of a lot of what's going to happen in the ensuing time before that cry is answered of how long. So, yeah, the future, I've said it before, there's so much wrong with the future view, the future approach to the book. It just, almost every single key doesn't work with it. And I was about to forget number 7 here. The kingdom is identified in the book of Revelation. The future view makes the kingdom some kind of physical, earthly power yet to be established. It's a literal physical kingdom. Revelation speaks of the kingdom. This was one of the keys, and we won't go back and reteach that, but it speaks of the kingdom as in existence at the time of the writing of the book. And the kingdom is of a spiritual nature. Jesus said very clearly, my kingdom is not of this world. John 18:36. So the future time view, it just doesn't work. There's just no way that you can look at that and say that's the correct approach to the book. Now another approach is the principles approach. This says the book is just a general overview of history. This view does have some things to commend it, but let's check and see if the keys work. Key number 2 is these are about things that are going to shortly come to pass. We've mentioned that several times. The principles view, it's also, by the way, called philosophical, the philosophical approach, some people call it that. That makes the book applicable to all times and all places. In a sense, there's obviously application. It wouldn't be included in the canon of Scripture by the Lord if there wasn't some application. But there's a real life situation here he's dealing with. And you can't just forget about that. There are things going on right there, right then, that he's dealing with and addressing. Key number 4, of course, the dragon and the beasts are identified. This approach, this philosophical approach, would say that the first beast is just any persecuting power. When again, when you look at all those cues and the clues that are given to you and the symbols, how can you come away with anything but the first beast is Rome? But this philosophical approach, well, it's just any persecuting power. Well, again, there's some application there. If we end up in a situation, God forbid, in our country, where our country, our leadership, our government is trying to stamp out Christianity, could we find some comfort from that? Sure, we should. But at the same time, there's a real situation going on right there when he's writing. And Christians are being persecuted by this entity pictured as a beast that is the nation of Rome. Same thing with the second beast. This view would say it's any false religion, but again, I think the clues are very strong and almost inescapable that this would be emperor worship. Key number 5, the harlot is identified. Well, this view would have the harlot just as worldly temptations that Christians have to face. Well, is there some application there? Yeah. But yeah, it's overgeneralizing and forgetting that there's a situation he's dealing with right there in the context. Again, the 1260 days, same thing. This view would have it be just the Christian age is what this view typically would say. That just doesn't fit. It just flat out doesn't fit. Let's kind of summarize here by saying that this view rightly encourages looking for modern day application in the book of Revelation. That's a good thing. But what this approach does, if you take this approach for the whole book, is it takes the book out of its original setting. And it takes away the primary meaning of the book. And we often say, I don't know who coined the phrase, but a text taken out of context becomes merely a pretext. There's application from the book, but you've got to keep it in its immediate context first. Any passage of the Bible, we've noticed this several times, has 3 contexts. There's the immediate context, and the immediate context here is first century saints are suffering, sometimes even to the point of death. They're suffering for the cause of Christ. That's your immediate context. There's a historical context. This would include Rome as a nation. This would include the lead up to Rome and the Grecian Empire, the lead up to that in the Medo-Persian Empire, and the lead up to that in the Babylonian Empire. That's the historical context. And then there's an overall biblical context. How does this fit into the overall scheme of redemption and the message of the entire Bible? And of course, that is the big picture of the book. Jesus wins. But every passage has those 3 contexts. So it just doesn't match what first century Christians would have seen. So we can take the principles view, and I think we can say that that's not the best approach to take as a whole. It has some commendable parts to it, such as, again, looking for application, but that's not the best approach to take. And then what about the world history view? This view says that the book foretells major historical events. The idea is that the book is predicting the history of the world between Jesus' first and second coming. But again, keys number 2 and 3, shortly coming to pass. These are about things which are shortly to come to pass. And the book is written to comfort persecuted Christians. Well, early Christians would not have seen centuries of world history in this message. There's just no comfort in that. You have taken away key number 3 if you're going to take this approach. There are some prophecies of future historical events for sure, but that's not the primary purpose of the book. It's not written to, it's not Jesus saying, John, write down, because I'm going to tell you what's going to unfold in the political realm throughout the world. And also, I'm going to tell you what's going to unfold in the religious realm. Are there some foreshadowing? Are there some prophecies in there? I think so. But that's not the primary purpose of the book. This is one that there are some people that I respect greatly that take this approach. And again, not everybody fits neatly into one of these approaches, because it may not be that they take this approach singularly. They may take some things from it. But you compare that to key number 3, comforting persecuted Christians. If this is, in fact, I'll give you, continuing our thoughts with this, keys number 4 and 6, the dragon and the beast are identified, as well as the 1260 days. Well, this approach, this world history approach, has the first beast as Rome, but it has the second beast as Roman Catholicism. A lot of things fit with that. But these beasts, they come and they go together in the text. And the second beast seeks to promote worship of the first. But Catholicism, they never promoted emperor worship. Now, there are things that Catholicism got way off on and remains way off on from Scripture. But I just don't think that fits. And again, in the context of comforting those persecuted Christians, what comfort is that to them? This view has the 1260 days as the dark ages, but again, that just doesn't fit. I say this view has the 1260 days as the dark ages. It just about depends on who you ask, because you can't find, in my experience at least, you can't find 2 people who take this approach to the book that agree on even a handful of the details. That alone tells me something. If you can't even agree on what this detail means, what are the 2 witnesses? Well, somebody says they're Martin Luther and somebody else. Yeah, that doesn't offer comfort to first century persecuted saints. It also just doesn't. There are holes in that as far as making it fit historically and all. So again, I know some people that I respect very much that take that approach. I don't know if there's a question unless you tell me. If you disagree, please tell me. I promise you, I got really thick skin. You will not hurt my feelings if you come and you say, I think you just missed it on that chat. I want to hear, the reasoning. I may not necessarily agree with it. I might say, you know what, never thought about that. But I may not. But, that's one that, like I said, I know a lot of people I respect tremendously that take that approach. I just don't think it fits. I don't think the keys work to unlock that door. Let's talk about another view, another approach here, the fall of Jerusalem. This says the book is all about AD 70. This is sometimes referred to as the preterist approach. Some people get more preterist with this than others, preterister, if you want to call it that. But some people go further with this than others. That's first bell, right? That better be the first bell. Let's speed up. What about key number 5? The harlot is identified. We talked about that in our keys, our 7 keys. But this view says that the harlot is Jerusalem. There's a problem with that. Jerusalem never sat on the back of or ruled over Rome. It was quite the opposite. There again, there's some faithful brethren that they don't go into all the wild realized eschatology stuff and all that, but they believe that Revelation was written much earlier. But if the harlot is Jerusalem, Jerusalem never ruled over Rome. I don't understand how. I just can't make that work. Key number 6, the 1260 days are identified. This view says the 1260 days are the Roman siege of Jerusalem leading up to AD 70. But again, there's a problem with that. AD 70 wasn't a war on the saints. It was a war on the Jews. Rome was fed up with the rebellion. There's no record that I'm aware of, at least, of any Christian dying in that siege or in that attack. It wasn't a war on the saints. At that time, the saints were not Jewish people. not Jews according to the flesh. It was spiritual Jerusalem, spiritual Israel, the church. It just doesn't fit. Again, this view also conflicts all the evidence for a later date for the book. Later, by later, I mean more like AD 96, as opposed to pre-AD 70. You got to throw out all that evidence for the later date on top of trying to reconcile these, and I just don't think those, I think those are irreconcilable. So again, I don't think that one works. I don't think that approach is going to work. That leaves us with the approach for, we called it the fall of Rome. This says the book deals with Roman persecution. This takes the various characters as figurative. The dragon is figurative for Satan. The beast is figurative, the first beast figurative of Rome. Second beast figurative of emperor worship. The 1260 days is figurative of a time of persecution. On and on. These figures are symbolic. It takes the events as beginning shortly after the writing of the book and playing out mostly over the years leading up to the fall of Rome, and I meant to put circa AD 475 there. I don't know exactly the year, although I think that actually is pretty exact as most of what history I've read. I think I might have read 476 before, but anyway, that matches keys number 1 and 2. This view also matches key number 3. If the book is about the fall of Rome, if you take that approach, is that of comfort to persecuted Christians? It absolutely is, because guess who's persecuting those Christians? Rome. Think about keys 4, 5, and 6, the dragon, the beast, the harlot, the 1260 days. It matches what we talked about in those keys, this view. It matches that. This view also takes, this approach takes the kingdom as spiritual, which matches key number 7. I think that is, again, some of the other keys have some things in them that are commendable, and especially that second one there with the principles or philosophical approach. It's got some commendable things in it as far as, making application from the book. But you can't take that as your whole approach, because you're forgetting about the immediate setting and the immediate context. I think this approach is the one to take. Now, that having been said, let's kind of close out with this. Determining the basic approach does not answer all of your questions. That's not going to just magically mean when we go and start studying the book that there'll never be a time we say, this is tough. And I'm not too proud to tell you, if I come to something and you ask a question or we say, what does that mean? If I don't know, I'll tell you. We'll look at it. We'll look at the evidence. We'll come to the best conclusion we can. But we're also not going to miss the forest for the trees. We're going to make sure we avoid missing the forest for the trees. But let me tell you something. Determining the best approach is an excellent starting point. That's why we have spent, 3, 4, 5 weeks now on introduction? Because now we have our study focused. We have our approach focused for the rest of our class. We're not going to get bogged down trying to keep every single approach in mind. Well, when we get to chapter 5, if you're taking the preterist approach, here's what this might mean. Now, if you go with the world history approach, here's what this might mean. And we're going with the fall of Rome approach, so we're not going to do all that. We've got our approach, and we're going to go with it. And that helps keep us from getting bogged down. I think it will simplify our study. I think it'll make our study a lot easier. It'll make it flow better, be smoother. And so that's how we're going to go about this. It's looking at this from the approach of the fall of Rome. Now we're ready to talk Revelation chapter 1. Next week, Lord willing. So you can tell Rachel we finished the introduction. So she'll be happy to hear that. Lord willing, next week we'll start with chapter 1. And chapter 1, 2, and 3 we'll move through, kind of hit the high points. And all of this we won't necessarily go verse by verse, but we'll begin looking at actual text, Lord willing, next week. Thank you very much.